Jesus Christ has to have a key place in the Catholic school, because it's Jesus Christ who reveals who our students truly are. These are young kids with a supernatural destiny. These are kids made in the image and likeness of God. So all of the kind of respect that they're due and so on it has a firm basis, and not just kind of the traditional basis that society would put on them.
Welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Sockold. This podcast and community are all about equipping Catholic educators like you to approach every subject area and your entire vocation as a teacher through the lens of our Catholic faith. Each month, I sit down with inspiring guests, and together we'll explore how every classroom can become a place of faith, truth, and beauty. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know a fellow Catholic teacher, share this podcast with them. Let's build this community together. Archbishop J. Michael Miller, welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast.
Thank you very much, Brett. Good to be with you.
It's great to chat with you again. For people who don't know, we're both people working in the church in Western Canada, so we see each other once in a while. But usually not on the question that we're tackling here today. Even though we both work a lot on the question of Catholic education, that's usually not where we encounter one another. So it's very exciting to be able to have this conversation.
Great. Looking forward to it, Brett.
So I want to start, people will be familiar, much of our listenership, I think, will be familiar with your small book, The Holy See's Teaching on Catholic Schools. And at the very bottom of the cover, if you read the small print, it says Secretary, Congregation for Catholic Education.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, that's not your current position.
It isn't.
But I thought it might be an interesting place to start to tell us a little bit about your time. First of all, what that position is, because I think a lot of us don't know very much about Vatican offices and how they work and what gets done in them. So a little bit about what the position is and about your time in that position.
Okay, sure. In those days, there were congregations. Now they're called dicasteries. But when I was kind of employed by the Vatican or the Holy See, it was called the Dicastery for Catholic Education. And what it is, it's basically the kind of ministry that helps kind of provide the oversight for Catholic education on behalf of the Pope throughout the world. And it was divided at that time into a section on universities, and what we call Catholic universities, also on faculties. There are faculties which are governed directly by the Holy See, unlike Catholic universities, which fall under episcopal conferences, dioceses, or religious institutes. And there was a section on schools, where the Holy See does not have any direct role over schools. It's mostly to provide kind of documents and general exhortation about the importance and value of Catholic schools. Perhaps in some countries that have a concordat or an agreement between the country and the nation to ensure that Catholic schools are among the privileges that are recognized and acknowledged. It was a surprise to me that I was named the secretary, which is the number 2 position. In each of these congregations or dicasteries, there is a head called the prefect, and then the secretary, who is the number 2 person. And then there is an undersecretary, and then there are various employees. In fact, people should know that the Holy See has very few employees by world standards. I think we were at the time, maybe there were 30 of us or 35, counting those who were more in the administrative typing division of the congregation. Our office was located just outside St. Peter's Square. When you're looking at St. Peter's, there are 2 buildings, one on the right and one on the left. They were office buildings erected in 1950 to provide space for various offices. And we were on the third floor on the building on the right. I ended up there, probably, I guess we should say, by divine providence or luck. I had done a stint previously in the Vatican serving in the Secretariat of State in the English language section for 5 years. So I had familiarity, of course, with sort of the Vatican, how it works, not directly in the congregation, of course. And I spoke Italian. So that was a help. And my immediate position before being named was I was president of the Catholic University in Houston, Texas, called the University of St. Thomas, run by the Basilian Fathers, founded by the Basilian Fathers as they founded other colleges in Western Canada, St. Mark's, St. Joseph's, and St. Thomas More. So I had a familiarity with higher education. I was also from North America, which was seen to be a plus at the time. And one day I received a call from the former head of where I worked in the Secretariat of State, now Cardinal Jim Harvey, an American with whom I had studied. And he said, "Can you come to Rome to meet with the prefect of the Congregation for Catholic Education? And don't say anything to anyone." So the next week, I got on a plane, went to Rome for lunch at Jim's place with the Cardinal, and I guess he wanted to make sure, who is this guy from North America? And then I think it was about a week later, there was the call from the nuncio that I had been appointed to the position of secretary. The secretary kind of takes care of all the paperwork goes through him. He's not the public face of the congregation, although I had some great trips to different places in the world. And I worked with very good folks. The undersecretary at the time eventually became secretary, and so he was very good, Monsignor Zani. It was an interesting place, and it certainly broadened my understanding of education and the life of the church around the world.
Right. Very good. Well, that leads well into my next question, which is sort of a kind of zooming out and thinking about the way the church approaches education in I would say in big picture terms, which is something like the church builds schools everywhere it goes. I mean, it's just
the church certainly built schools. So we'll talk about schools as opposed to universities and faculties, because that's our main interest. I know that there are about 50 million kids in Catholic schools, at least around the world. And you're right. One of the first initiatives of missionaries, particularly in the classical sense of, say, 75 or 100, 150 years ago, they built clinics and they built schools. And these were not, it's interesting, these were not schools, of course, for Catholic children. They were schools for the local population, usually or often kind of certainly not wealthy. They were schools for the poor in all of the nations around the world. They took with them a tradition, of course, of Catholic education that was well developed in North America and in Europe, and especially in the hands of religious communities. Most Catholic schools were run by religious. It's a little bit different from our model, where schools were often founded by religious, but they were often belonged to the diocese, who then asked religious to serve in the schools. Whereas in Europe and so on, they were actually schools that mostly belonged to religious as their property and primary apostolate. But schools have always been seen as key to passing on the faith to children, and as places of the appropriate socialization of the young. At the same time, there's always the kind of the insistence upon parents being the primary educators of their children. and that schools assist them in most circumstances, but not in every circumstance, that there is a place for parents to actually do what we call homeschooling, which is fairly common in North America, not at all common in the rest of the world.
Right.
That
Right.
seems to be a North American phenomenon, talking about it, because the emphasis was on the school as the place of the educational project where that took place.
Right. It's interesting to think, like, in the mission of the church,
Right.
by and large, as you said, the goal was to provide education to lift up people in
Poverty.
poverty, right, and those kinds of and whereas today in Canada and in large parts in the United States, our understanding of the justification of Catholic schools, it's the place where Catholic parents can send their kids so that they can be raised in the faith, so that what they're hearing in school comports with what they're getting at home and at the parish.
Precisely.
And so that's a different cultural context than founding schools for people who may well be non-Catholic, but what you're trying to better their material
Yes.
lives and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, I think that was a big shift in some of the countries where that was the original purpose for schools. Of course, over time, communities developed which were Catholic, and so they served increasingly, just as in North America, Catholic children in the schools. But that was not the first. That was by no means the original intention of the erection of schools in large parts of Africa and Asia.
Right. I remember in grad school, I met lots of people from Japan and India who were non-Catholic, who had gone to Catholic schools and had a very high opinion. You know, all the best schools, were Catholic schools, they talked about.
Yeah, that's very true here in Vancouver, where we have a large population from Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, Catholic schools there was an enormous number of them, several hundred, I think. And they were in a sense the best schools for the academic and in some ways too the moral formation of young people, much appreciated by non-Catholics, and most of the schools had majority non-Catholics in the schools. There are other countries, for example, Vietnam, where Catholic schools were not so prevalent, and so the Vietnamese immigrants, they don't have that innate kind of sense that Catholic schools are the best schools. It's a little different from each culture brings its own understanding of schools. The Filipinos also appreciate Catholic education because in the Philippines, the Catholic schools were known to be very good schools.
Right. So this brings us, I think, let's start thinking about your little book that you wrote and the context in which that emerged, because it was written in an American context.
It was.
I mean, part of the first bit of the chapter is sort of setting the social context in the American Catholic school sort of ecosystem,
right?
Where this other pattern that we're discussing, where it's Catholic parents sending their kids to Catholic schools, hoping that they get raised Catholic, is the larger piece in a lot of the case, not exclusively, but in a lot of the cases.
In a lot of the cases.
Do you want to tell us just a little bit, first of all, where the book came from,
Sure.
and maybe even it's famous for its 5 marks,
right?
And so you had to make some judgment calls. You had to pick 5 and organize your thoughts around those 5. So maybe tell us a little bit of the story of where it came from.
Yeah, the book is the product of a talk that I gave at the Catholic University of America, that I was invited to by a Catholic association. And one of the main sponsors of that was a kind of a Catholic philanthropist, Frank Hanna from Atlanta. And I just gave the talk. I was invited because I was obviously, from North America, could speak English, and I was the secretary of the congregation when I give a talk. And so I prepared this talk using notes that I had in hand from previous talks, particularly that I'd done in Ireland, when Ireland was in the throes of a lot of its schools being rethought as Catholic and being handed over and so on. To be honest, I can't remember exactly why I put together 5. I usually work with 10 or 12. I like numbers. Homilies can be 3, but other talks can be 5 or 10. And so I guess I just gathered these thoughts, thought it would be good as a mnemonic device to have 5 marks. I had no idea it was ever even going to be published in a pamphlet. That didn't occur to me at all, and frankly kind of surprised because I've given lots of talks and they don't get published or circulated.
Right. Well, you kind of never know when you put something out there.
You don't.
What's going to happen?
I bet you know that, Brett.
Yes, that's part of the game we're in. But it's interesting how it caught on. The 5 marks have become things that schools and dioceses use in assessing the Catholicity
Right.
of their schools and how they're achieving their mission and all this kind of stuff. And even in my own work, we'll get to this a little more detail later. But basically, number 4, imbued with a Catholic worldview throughout the curriculum. I started working in that area, and the desire to learn more about this and to really dig in there has kind of overwhelmed me. Like I'm feeling kind of like you. I just had no idea what was going to happen when you put that out there. And so, maybe talk a little bit about some of the work or the reaction that's followed from that. I know even in the Archdiocese of Vancouver, they use those marks as part of sort of self-assessment. And so maybe walk us through a little bit of each of them and sort of what they look like and how they play in sort of practical terms, how schools or dioceses are using them for things like assessment or for professional development, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I do know that schools are using it as part of their assessment of Catholic identity, which has really kind of come on its own in more recent years. I don't think when I was going to school, or I taught briefly in high school, that we worried much about assessing the Catholic identity. But nowadays, I think school boards, sometimes even parents or parishioners, they talk about, is our school really, is it really Catholic? Is it doing the Catholic job that we expect of it? And rather than have people just sort of use endless anecdotes to say, yes, it's doing a great job, or no, it's not doing a great job, I think they found it helpful to have some criteria that are at least potentially really objective, by which they can benchmark the Catholicity of their schools. The first one is probably the most general, and I call it inspired by a supernatural vision. I might reformulate that today to be, say, inspired, or add the phrase inspired by a supernatural vision and by the church's evangelizing mission. But be that as it may. But I thought that it's important that we see schools as truly ecclesial realities. The Catholic school is an ecclesial reality. It's just like if they belong either to a diocese or specifically, I think they should be integrated somehow, whether directly or a little indirectly, with a parish, that they're ecclesial, and therefore their vision has to be rooted in the church's mission. And the church's mission, of course, is evangelization, is making disciples. So that a Catholic school has to be concerned with transcendental realities. It's simple. It's that simple, that it can't. People have different formulations of this. We had a school board superintendent who loved to talk about our schools make saints. They're in the saint making business and so on. It depends how you want to formulate it. But the big thing is it's ecclesial, churchy.
Right. I wonder if I just might ask, because this, I think it relates to this question and sets us up for the next. When you said in the past, we didn't think about the Catholic identity of our school so much, it wasn't a prominent question. And I'm wondering if the framework is sort of, as Catholics are increasingly aware of sharp differences between a Catholic worldview and the sort of more mainstream contemporary worldview, that schools become a place where we say, well, we can't just be going along with what's happening in the culture more broadly. And so something like Catholic identity, which might have been taken for granted in a time when we were less aware and maybe there was less difference between a Catholic worldview and the broader culture, something like what you just said, animated by a supernatural vision, it's hard to think that most of the curricula you'd be getting from the provincial government would be animated by a supernatural vision. So there's a sense of distinction that maybe wasn't there in the past that is probably animating a lot of this.
Absolutely. I think in the past, the difference between a Catholic school and a public school wasn't seen to be so vast, particularly in the areas of moral formation, like teaching, arithmetic, and so on. Reading, maybe not so different. But now people are increasingly aware that the Catholic schools aren't just schools with a little bit of catechism, that they something more is expected and wanted and has to be provided.
And I think that's a great way to think of why your 5 marks, I think, caught. I think a big part of it, from my perspective, is they landed on a Catholic public that was starting to ask these kinds of questions. And those marks, each of them in their own way, gave them ways to be able to start answering what is the distinctiveness that we find, because we feel the need for some kind of distinctiveness.
Exactly. No, I think you're right. I hadn't looked at it that way before, but that it landed on ears ready to hear something that could maybe articulate or put into some sort of coherent message.
Right.
What was different? Why bother with a Catholic school in our neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So it's animated by supernatural vision. Number 1 obviously fits that pattern. Let's go to number 2.
Yeah, number 2 is founded on a Christian anthropology, which is just a simple way of saying that it's founded on an understanding of who we are, our students, in this case, our pupils, our kids, an understanding of the human person that is founded on divine revelation. In other words, on the Gospels, on the teaching of the church, on that wonderful phrase that comes from the Second Vatican Council. It's only in the mystery of the Word made flesh, of the Son of God becoming incarnate, that the mystery, or who the human person is, becomes clear or known. And so we have to have, Jesus Christ has to have a key place in the Catholic school, because it's Jesus Christ who reveals who our students truly are. These are young kids with a supernatural destiny. These are kids made in the image and likeness of God. So all of the kind of respect that they're due and so on it has a firm basis, and not just kind of the traditional basis that society would put on them. And it also, I think it means that the gospel can, because of Jesus Christ, that it comes into the life of the community, of the school community.
Right. I find in my own work, I link number 4, which we'll get to, with number 2. If you want to imbue a curriculum with a Catholic worldview, the way I've introduced it is, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what is the goal for the people in front of you? And of course, there are legitimate worldly goals.
Yes, of course.
Employability,
right?
3 cheers for getting a decent job when you're done Catholic school. But you're not actually a widget in a machine. You're a person made in the image and likeness of God, destined for eternal glory.
Life. Yeah.
Right. And if that's the most important thing about you, then the way you're going to spend the bulk of your time for the next 12 or 15 years should point in that direction. Because if it's mostly concerned with making you a good widget or a good widget maker, you have this sort of cognitive dissonance where on the one hand, you're like, okay, so I'm an eternal creature with an eternal destiny, but actually the thing that's most important, or at least that demands most of my time, seems to be very oriented to this worldly kinds of concerns. And once you see that, then you can ask a question like, well, what difference does it make when in math class? That kind of thing, right?
And that's where you are so helpful. You tell us how it can work in math class.
right. Yeah, so I just want to make the connection between 2 and 4 because I find that anthropology, getting a clear sense of what our final goal is with these students is like college readiness is great,
Right.
but like seek ye first the kingdom, and the other, college readiness will be added unto it.
Yeah, no, that's really good, and I think that's something even with good Catholic parents that we have to kind of remind them of when sometimes they like a lot of the things about the Catholic school, but still college readiness or the best colleges still rates maybe a little too high
Right.
in their minds. I
And
hesitate to
I've been
go
to
there, but
places where the football program might be
yes,
rating a little
indeed.
too high.
Yeah, I mean, I think this should help provide some perspective on how we see everything that goes on in the school.
Right, right. Number 3.
Yeah, number 3 is called it should be animated by communion and community. That the and this is, I think, just a way of trying to say that it a school is a community of persons, that we are persons, and this is tries to capture a little bit of the notion that the church itself is a communion between God and ourselves, and a communion of people with one another. And this I think is something that people often remark on, not using those words, but they often do talk about the particular community of a Catholic school or the feeling of a Catholic school. Um, and this shows itself in a couple of ways, or can be evaluated in a couple of ways. Some of these, certainly, they're not unique to a Catholic school, but the whole notion um, of of teamwork, people working together, that in some way a school it should be, particularly in elementary school, a kind of prolongation of the family life of the home in terms of how people interact with one another. Secondly, though, and this maybe is much more for those actually in the schools or in administration, Catholic schools are a community which exists within the church, and therefore the educators in the school, admin, teachers, assistants, have a unique relationship um, with the bishop and with the pastor of the territory within which the school is located. That there is nothing really comparable in public schools, and that because they're ecclesial realities, that they relate to the fullness of the church, which of course is both the local church or the particular church of the diocese, and the parish. I think that that's really important, and can be forgotten sometimes. Schools run by religious communities sometimes have not been as well integrated into the life of the local church community as I think that they should be. Their schools are an important part of a diocesan strategy, pastoral plan, whatever you want to call it, and therefore calls for trust, open and sincere dialogue among particularly among educators and ecclesial, to use the term, authorities,
Right.
without carrying the baggage of bossing.
Right. No, I find that the 2-part answer you gave there very helpful, because I think the first part is of course very true, but easy to say.
Yeah,
Oh, we have a great environment here, which good. I mean,
yeah,
God bless you. That's fantastic. But sometimes easy to say in a way that does not give it a particularly Catholic or Christian valence. I mean, it's just like, let's
yeah,
treat each other nice, which is good.
yeah,
Please do. But to be supplemented by that is shaped by a broader relationship between this community and the community in which it's situated, diocesan, parish, the community of faith more broadly. You can treat each other great in the school, and please do. But if the integration, if all that's separating you is a parking lot from the parish, but you never see each other,
right,
your decisions aren't made in concert with one another. all of that kind of stuff, which, I mean, we know this can happen, right? And it's a real lost opportunity for the mission of both to be separated from each other that way.
Yeah, we sometimes sloppily, but commonly use the language because that there is the parish and the school, which just immediately sets up two two distinct realities. And somehow I wish there was a better way, a better language or terminology to express that the school is integral to the parish.
Right.
That there's a close connection. Otherwise, we see them as each kind of able to go in its own direction, and there has to be a synergy between them if they're going to be if we're going to get maximum value out of each reality.
Right.
The worshiping community, which we sometimes call the parish, but the school should be as part of that. It's not.
Right.
And people who don't have children who are faithful parishioners, it's their school too. I'd like to see, and I haven't come up with a vocabulary that makes that clearer. Or
Right. I just I was in Lansing, Michigan a couple weeks ago, and this is the first time I was invited to do this kind of work. I did a joint retreat for pastors and principals.
Right.
So all the principals and pastors got together for a day, and to do some common visioning on their school. And I just thought it was a great way.
No, that's
to do
wonderful. Yeah, we do that here in Vancouver. We have pastor principal meetings, and they're successful if the pastor shows up.
This was a big question that day, was how many pastors are going to show up, and we were happy more of them showed up than we thought might. So,
good.
Anyway,
yeah. Great.
So this podcast and this community are called Making Every Class Catholic.
Okay.
Which is a catchy way of saying. I hope it's catchy.
It is catchy.
I'm kind of in for a dime, in for a dollar at this point. I hope it's a catchy way of saying, imbued with a Catholic worldview throughout its curriculum, which is your fourth point. So
it is.
I know everyone's waiting to hear your thoughts on this one.
Well, you're the expert on that now, Brett. I think that this was important and made the point. I think I read it in some book. Every school has a worldview. Every school is working with an ethos or a philosophy. They might claim that they don't, but every secular school and so on, every school has that. And therefore, it's certainly appropriate that we say that a Catholic school should have a Catholic worldview. It should be operating, that it should really work to create, it should create an environment which is Catholic, but also have a curriculum which breathes the Catholic ethos, because I think that there is a way of talking Catholic aside from just living Catholic. There's a way in which we want to form people to think in a certain way. This is not indoctrination. It just means thinking in light of the gospel, which has been handed down in the community of the church. And also to get away from what some people, and this is quite true in Europe, where there are often, as in Italy, you're allowed to have religious instruction, 40 minutes a week or something in a public school, which means that the Catholic dimension is put in one classroom and it rests there. It's a temptation of our own schools, or it used to be more, that, it's Catholic because they get catechism or they get religious education in high school, and they go to Mass once a month, and they come in with ashes on their foreheads on Ash Wednesday. There are a few those are admittedly some external markers maybe, but it's falls short. Catholicism is frankly, it's a way of living, it's a way of life. And I think a Catholic school has to deliver on its promise of providing students with an integral education, one that integrates faith, culture, and life. Because we have takes on such fundamental things as truth, that our reason and our faith work together in harmony and so on. there are a lot of things that go into the worldview. We have a particular take on the importance of the body, not shared by a society which is, I think, Gnostic in many ways. And so, to me, this is, and you've developed it so well that Catholicism cannot be exiled or put in the place of a single subject matter that is kind of dealt with, and even dealt with appropriately. And the rest goes with a few statues around. That's not a Catholic school.
Right.
That's just not a Catholic school.
When you describe a cultural approach to a question, in this case, the body, as Gnostic, I think it gets at something really key, which is you don't get the option of not presenting some worldview or other.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Everybody's doing it all the time.
Everybody's doing it all the time. And so to make a bold proposal and ask someone to think about it and integrate it and take it seriously is not the same thing as indoctrination.
No.
In fact, doing the reverse, actually, right? Pretending to make no proposal at all is often the groundwork. Some pretense to neutrality. The Gnostic claim doesn't come across as, well, this is a Gnostic view about the body, which we are presenting as true here.
No.
It's just a straightforward sort of truth claim that then doesn't allow for the possibility of a critical engagement. Whereas a bold proposal done well, you can disagree with it and still learn something.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial, and thank goodness for your book, which teases this out in a wonderful way.
Well, thank you so much. Well, maybe we'll circle back. I know some of the questions from the community are going to be focused on that particular thing, but let's put a bow on the 5 before we circle back to that. So what's the 5th mark?
The 5th one is sustained by gospel witness. In other words, that we need witnesses in our school, witnesses to Jesus Christ and the gospel among our teachers and, I guess, administrators. Why don't we just say all the educators? That this bearing witness in a school is part of an essential responsibility of those who are administering and teaching in it. There's that wonderful phrase of Paul VI from, I think, Evangelii Nuntiandi, the evangelization in the modern world, when he says, modern men and women listen more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if they do listen to teachers, it's because they are witnesses. That this is just a claim, I think, for authenticity. That to have someone who is in a teaching position and interacts with students all the time, who doesn't believe what they're teaching or doesn't believe in the values of the school where they are teaching, is countercultural, and I think is certainly by no means certainly not the ideal. I think if a person is unable to be a witness, they're probably ill-equipped really to be teaching in a Catholic school. That might sound a little harsh, but I can't see any way that would say somebody who is a counter witness is of value to the school. It doesn't mean, there's places where they don't have to be Catholic, but they're willing, they accept the values and the traditions of the school and wouldn't dream of being seen as acting against it by students who intuit, inauthenticity better than we do. And I think there's no reason why they should be in the pay of a Catholic school board, Catholic parish, or Catholic parents.
Right. You bring up an interesting point at the end there, right? It's the church wants everyone working in our schools to be a witness, and we don't strictly equate that with everyone working in the school being a Catholic, which is an interesting distinction, right?
Yeah, because you could be, bring your baptismal certificate and be alienated, unhappy, crabby, and not at all in love with your faith. And you could be an evangelical who loves the Lord, is practicing and espouses the values. So it's not absolutely identical with a baptismal certificate. But boy, to have people who are not, as we say, on board with the mission is foolishness. No company in the world hires people who don't accept what it is doing and its mission. I mean, to be working for Ford and talking up Honda just doesn't work. And, I think that we have to kind of be forthright about that. Sometimes it's hard to find teachers, etc., but to find somebody who cannot be a witness or is a counter witness, maybe you're forced into somebody who's just, neither for nor against, but somebody who doesn't like what you're doing, and they're not espousing Catholic values and don't want to. Better know one.
Right.
I really think that
one of the pieces that is complementary to the work I'm doing and the work of this community is in a certain sense, you could frame it this way. I'm doing like professional development. I'm doing PD,
right.
But PD can only get you so far if you're not doing HR.
Right.
And so what you're describing in a certain sense is an HR question. And there are a few big pieces about, where are people studying to become teachers?
Right.
And how is that equipping them to work in Catholic schools? How are we connecting the people who have those commitments with people who are doing hiring in Catholic schools? There's various projects that are starting to move in that direction. It feels to me like they're sort of parallel to the work that I'm doing.
Yep.
The zeitgeist, the desire is there, and we both need each other. We need to be able to be forming these people
right.
to teach from a Catholic worldview. But if they don't want to be formed, good luck.
Exactly. It won't work. I know we can't. I mean, in British Columbia, we have no Catholic faculty of education. We have to be willing as a diocese and as individual schools actually to begin to provide for the formation of teachers who through no, it's not their fault that they ended up going to a very secular faculty of education. We have to start to make up that, to build on what they have a natural piety they want to teach in a Catholic school, but they might not be well equipped to be the kind of witness that they really probably aspire to be, but just don't have the tools to be.
I've seen this. It's one of the things that frustrates me is how easy it is for people to blame teachers for the lack of Catholicity. And sometimes you've got teachers with all the good heart in the world who, through no fault of their own, couldn't have got that formation anywhere.
Exactly.
And we need to do something. So maybe that's a conversation we take offline. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
No, I think that's very true.
We're coming to the end of the publicly available part of the podcast. We're still new at this, so to remind our audience, after we wrap this part, that I'm going to stay on with Archbishop Miller briefly and share some questions that came directly from the community that will be available in the extended episode within the community. But just as we wrap this portion, Archbishop Miller, you're coming near the end of your time. I don't think we're making any sort of public announcement here that's not already well known. Near the end of your time as Archbishop of Vancouver.
Right.
So anything that you want to share with us about your plans, where you're heading?
Yeah.
Any work you might be planning to do with Catholic educators, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'll be going back to where I came from. I'll be going back to the University of St. Thomas, and I'll be living in the Basilian Community House that is on campus at the university. We actually built a new residence about 8 years ago, and there's room for seminarians on one side and then priests on the other. So I'll be there with my confreres across from the library. I imagine that I'll be doing some. I don't think I want to teach a regular class and correct papers again. But I certainly be love to be able to do lots of occasional things and so on. And I'm sure I'll be involved in the university. I'm on the board and so on. So that's where I'll be, within a few months. I don't know exactly. They don't give you long-term notice. They give you notice that it's coming, but I think they probably don't have the successor named yet. So.
All right. Well, Archbishop Miller, let me conclude by thanking you not only for joining me here today on this podcast, but thanking you for your ministry as Archbishop of Vancouver and also your ministry with respect to Catholic education, for the book, for the talks, for the constant support you've been, I know, in Western Canada, but even well beyond that, everywhere I go, people are familiar with your work and grateful for it. So on behalf of myself and our whole community here, thank you so much for your service.
Thank you. Thank you, Brett. Okay.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I want to tell you about the Making Every Class Catholic online community. There you'll have access to regular live interactions with me and with plenty of great presenters and presentations, workshops, and Q&A, as well as to a network of committed Catholic educators and a growing library of resources. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most important of all, share this with a fellow Catholic educator. We've got more exciting guests lined up in the months to come. You won't want to miss them. Until then, God bless you in your work, making every class Catholic.